Hey, everybody. Welcome to Fresh Take from What Fresh Hell Laughing in the Face of Motherhood. This is Amy. Today, I'm talking to Esau McCaulley. He is an author and associate professor of New Testament at Wheaton College. Esau is the go to writer on race relations in America, covering such topics as poverty, gun control, celebrity, education, and white supremacy for outlets including The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and Christianity Today. Esau's new memoir, How Far to the Promised Land, questions the narrative of exceptionalism that he and other Black survivors are conditioned to give when they make it in America. Esau is married to Mandy, a pediatrician and a Navy reservist, and together they have four wonderful children. Welcome, Esau.
Thank you so much. I'm probably going to get in trouble if I don't acknowledge that I work for the New York Times. They will probably get mad
Oh, good.
if they were the ones who were left out, but I'm a contributing opinion writer for them, and I don't want my
Oh,
bosses yelling at me. So
and
if you hear me, bosses, I said the New York Times. So don't
and
don't don't send me an email.
most of all, the New York Times.
Yeah,
So, Esau, let's start with the sort of the germ of this book, which is for most of your life, you were taught to see yourself as an exception, somebody
yeah,
who, through hard work and faith and determination, overcame childhood poverty, anti-Black racism, and an absent father to make it as a
yeah.
university professor, father of four. And that is all true, but that sort of narrative of exceptionalism was all called into question one night. And tell us about that.
Yeah. So in 2017, I was, well into adulthood. I had like the four kids, and we were living in a nice suburban place in Rochester, New York. And I got a phone call in the middle of the night. And the news from my sister, who called me weeping, was that my father had died in California. We're actually Southerners. We're from the South in Alabama, and he had died on a trucking trip and a single car accident in California, far from everyone that he knew. And my father had abandoned us when we were younger, and I didn't know him very well. He'd been in and out of our life. When he had been in our life, he had been abusive, struggled with drugs and addiction. And it quickly became clear in the context of a few conversations with our family that they wanted me to do the eulogy. They wanted me to deliver the eulogy for his funeral.
And you're a preacher,
I'm
so
a
or have
preacher.
been a
I'm a
preacher.
preacher. I had
So,
been a preacher. At that point, I was just a university professor. I was no longer
okay.
serving in a local church, and I still don't serve in church. I'm a lowly professor at this point. But my family asked me if I would do the eulogy. And anyone who's ever heard knows about a eulogy. You actually have to get to know the person who you're eulogizing. That's kind of an important part of it, which is odd that it was my father. And so it led to me sitting down with members of my family and finding out about his story. And you can't find anything about his story without touching on my story.
Mhm.
And I learned a lot from that. I learned, for example, that his great grandmother was a tenant farmer who um, saved up money to buy a plot of land in the context of segregation and Jim Crow, and that he had it. My father had his own trauma. One of the last things that my father was told by his father was that he was never going to be anything, and that he had his own history of trauma and abandonment. And in the midst of doing the research for the eulogy, it forced me. Anytime you're writing a eulogy, you're trying to find some meaning and purpose and some beauty in a human life, even a life that was complicated. And that struggle to find beauty and something redemptive from a very broken life changed the way that I told my own story, especially when I began to see that our story that began with my great grandmother, through my grandmother, through my father, onto me, is really the story of America.
Mm.
That it's not just me who is important in the context of what's going on in the South, but it's my grandmother, my great grandmother, my father, and even people on both sides of my family. Because one of the things about being Black and in the South, we're never separated from the American story. What I mean by that is that you can have enough money and resources to kind of put yourself out of the midst of controversy. When you're poor and you're Black, Jim Crow really matters to you. When you're poor and you're Black, segregation really impacts the way that you live your life. And so by simply telling the story of my family across these generations, I began to tell the story of America. And so I realized that the only stories then aren't the stories in which people make it. It's the stories in which all of us are struggling to find meaning and purpose. And in that process of writing the eulogy and finding about these stories fundamentally changed how I see the world.
You say in the book that I don't want to speak about overcoming racism and poverty as a hero.
Yeah.
Nobody escapes poverty. You say we're marked by it.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things about like people say that you escape poverty. Well, unless you take your entire family and extended family and every friend that you know with you, you still return to those same communities. I still go home to the exact same neighborhood. As a matter of fact, in 2 or 3 days, I'm going to get on a plane and go back to Huntsville. And so the people that you know that are still struggling and making a way through poverty, they're still a part of your life. The community that shaped you are still a part of your life. But not only that, the memories still are there. So, for example, I live in a nice neighborhood, but I make sure every door in my house is still locked at night. I'm very cautious about my children. My wife is much more, let the kids go and play. I was like, I need to know exactly where you are and what you're up to. And so there's these habits. And one of the things that you really ask yourself, and I've struggled with this, and I talk about it in the book. So when my son has a baseball game or a soccer game or anything, I make sure that I'm there. I don't want
Mhm.
to miss any of them. And I sometimes think, am I going there because I want to love my child? Or am I going there because I want to prove that I'm better than my father, who wasn't there for my games? And so even when you're doing things differently than the childhood that I knew, you're still shaped by them. I don't think that we escape our past. In some sense, our past shapes the way that we perceive the world. It even shapes our hopes and our dreams.
I'm going to use another phrase you use in the book because I thought it was perfect. Like your past is more than the tragic backdrop to your feats of grit and determination, right?
Yeah.
The people in your life are more than that, or more than proof of how
Yeah.
great you are.
So yeah, I think that I tell this story in the book about when I was getting ready to go to college, and you have to write the essay. It's really interesting post, the end of affirmative action.
Yeah.
But we had to tell the story. You have to write these essays to get into college, and I don't know how to get into college. Nobody in my family had gone, and except for my sister, who was a year older than me, 2 years older than me. And so I said to the counselor, "How do you do it? How do you get into college?" And she says, "Well, tell them a sob story." Tell them that they have a chance to pluck this poor black kid from the kind of the burning fires of poverty and put them into a different circumstance. But that always felt so fake because they didn't actually know my neighborhood. Like they didn't know my mom's food or what it was like to walk the halls of my high school or what it was like to live in my neighborhood. So I had to tell them a simplified story.
Right.
And that simplified story is it's the story that they want to hear. And if you tell their story well, they give you all of the stuff. They let you in the school, they let you in the graduate school. They give you an opportunity to write about how you overcame I call it the Horatio Alger story dipped in chocolate. But what can happen is if you're not careful, you can actually start to believe that story. That you can start to believe that and it's kind of funny. I see it on social media, grind culture. You just got to believe, you got to manifest. That's just simply not true. There's tons of people who tried really hard, who worked really hard, and who didn't get what they manifested. It's just not true. And so, what I wanted to say is, I wanted to tell a story in which, because of the community that I came from, there is a lot of trauma. There is a lot of death. People die in the book, but I wanted to treat their lives as meaningful in and of themselves, apart from what they taught me and how they spurred my narrative on.
Yes. Yes.
And so that was what I was trying to do. And the sad part about this is that only the survivors get to tell the story. And I wanted to give some of these characters a dignity in death that they didn't get in life. And so I wanted to show that there was tons of people who are talented and gifted and smart and clever in my community. And it's not just a few exceptional people that make it. The real story of my childhood is America destroys too many talented Black people before they have a chance to become what they might have become in other circumstances.
We're talking to Esau McCaulley. His new memoir is How Far to the Promised Land, and we'll be right back. Esau, I wanted to talk about your mom, who is
Oh,
a huge part of this book. Your mom, Lori, she
yeah,
raised 4 kids alone.
yeah,
And you talk in the book about this era. Some of our listeners might be too young to remember this, but I remember it well, in an era of the demonization of welfare queens. So let's
yeah,
talk a little bit about what that meant.
yeah. In the days before social media, it was all talk radio. It's kind of where like what we now consider like radical right wing media stuff was kind of found its initial home, and it was in the newspapers and those kinds of things. And the idea was there was these black women who were living high on the hog, as we would say it in the South, off of these big, huge government checks. And they didn't work, and they just lived off of everybody else's labor. Matter of fact, one of the interesting things, that recent song, Rich Men North of Richmond,
Yes.
actually refers to it. These women, these overweight women supposedly, who are getting these welfare checks. And so there's this real hatred towards people who are on government assistance. Well, during that time period, my mom got a brain tumor, and that brain tumor left her disabled. And we went tumbling down the economic ladder. She had worked as a factory worker at Chrysler, but we wound up on government assistance. And I think we're making, I forget the number, it's in the book, it's like $24,000 a year or something like that
For a family of how
for a
many?
family of four. Well, five of us, four children and my mother. But she was a single woman raising four kids, and she was in some sense the manifestation of the stereotype. And you felt that judgment. I tell this one story about when I first realized that we were poor. We were going to church, but it wasn't the church that we normally go to. It was just a church down the road from where we live. And it wasn't a Sunday. It was the middle of the week. And I was a little bit confused as to why we were in church. My mom took us to church all of the time, but it was normally our regular church. And I went in, and it was like a grocery store, like on the inside of this church building. And there was like the little carts and everything. And my mom was putting in items, like, and I realized, oh, this is a charity place where they give food to people who can't afford it. And for me, like my shoulders just dropped. It's like, oh, I can't believe we can't afford to buy regular food. When I looked at my mom, she had this sense of like steely eyed determination and dignity, that she went about her her shopping as if it was just an ordinary day. And so one of the things that I took from that is that, like, our regardless of what other people said about us, regardless of what's going on in the wider world, that struggle didn't have to take away your dignity. It didn't have to take away your aspirations. My mom, even though we were poor and we lived in a difficult location, she made it clear that we could become, all of us, the four of us, could become whatever our talents would enable us to become. And she instilled a hope in a context where it would be really nihilistic. I could tell you more about some of the stuff that she did, but I'll say one more thing about, because she's the hero of the book.
Please.
Um, when she was disabled, I won't get into the details of why, but she actually couldn't work during the time because of the way that the drugs affected her pituitary gland and those kinds of things. But what she did is she began to volunteer at the high school, or the middle school, then the high school. And so instead of going to work, she would come to the school every day, and she began to tutor like other kids in the school. And she became basically the school's mom. It got to the point where she was more popular in my high school than I was. And she ended up becoming the head of the PTA in our high school, and then the president of the Alabama State PTA. And then what the first Black, I think probably still the only single Black mother ever elected to office in the city of Huntsville, Alabama. And if anyone knows, she was elected to the school board. If anyone knows anything about school boards, a lot of the people who are on the school board are independently wealthy, and they could just, it doesn't really matter. They just do it as a kind of a thing to do in politics. But she was on welfare on the school board. I just don't think that's ever happened before. And it just showed us what was possible. And so I will forever be grateful to her and the way in which she instilled in us that sense of possibility. But as I go on to say in the book, there are other parents who also instilled that sense of possibility through their children, and through no fault of their own, some of their children lost their lives. And so even that idea isn't as simple as you need a great mom, because you need a great mom, you also need things to go your way.
So your father was an addict, and he was in and out of the picture, in and out of prison. Your mom had a brain tumor,
Yeah.
and you're a child in this situation. I'm giving
Yeah.
another quote from your book. You say, children of single parents learn to dole out their own traumas in very small doses. So
Yeah.
how are you how are you growing up through all this? Are you feeling like I have to get everything right?
One of the things that you notice, it becomes pretty clear, that my mom was making a sacrifice for me. I could tell the fatigue that she
Mm.
had even when she tried to hide it. And so I wanted her to feel like it was working. So I didn't tell her everything that was going on in my life because I didn't want to add another burden to her. I talk about the first time I go to school. I'm in first or second grade, and I'm sick. And most of the time, when you're sick with a single mom, you don't call unless it's a real emergency. I'm genuinely sick on this day, so I go to the front office to make a phone call, but somehow the number had it wasn't the correct number for her job. I just called this random white guy, and the first time I asked for my mom, he gets mad and he hangs up, and then I call again, and he says to me, "You N word, you need to know how to use the phone," and he hangs up again. And that was the first time I'd ever been called a racial slur. It's the first time that I understood that, like, being Black can make someone angry. And I remember thinking as a kid, how did he know over the phone that I was Black?
Yeah.
How did he know? Like, was there some flaw in how I spoke? And that incident was kind of like the first introduction to being Black as the world sees it, not as it Black was defined in my community. But I went home and I never told my mom. As a matter of fact, my mom said she didn't even know about it until she read the book. So she opened it up as you all go, "Oh, I didn't know this happened to you in first grade." And so as a parent of as a child of a single mom, you just learn that there are certain things that you have to handle for yourself. Um, and it's almost like we're both lying to each other.
Mm.
My mom's lying about how hard it is to give us a sense of things are going to be okay. We're lying about how great things are going. And I think that's the reason why, if you listen to a lot of hip hop, and I talk about this in the book, around this time period, there's a lot of rappers during the 80s and the 90s came from single parent homes. You have all of these rap songs about Dear Mama by Tupac and all of these things, which there's a tremendous amount of gratitude for the things that our mothers did to allow us to have an opportunity to have a better life.
You talk about how the welfare queen sort of stigma attaches itself to the kids, and it
Yeah,
creates. You talk about the high schools in your town. There was a white high
yeah,
school and a black high school,
yeah,
and if the
yeah,
white high school was in the newspaper, it was because, like, yet again they have
yeah.
1,800 national merit scholars.
It's
And if
it's
your
it
high school's in the newspaper, it's because like another fight, right? Another
yeah.
disappointment.
It's funny because I'm a grown man and I still don't like that high school. And I see like it's the high school where people with money come from. So like I still run into people from that high school. And I don't know why I'm mad at them. Like it's not like these individuals like Grissom High School. Oh, I said it out loud. But it's okay. God bless Grissom. But it was Grissom High School and on the other side, and they were one of the top schools in the state. And we were one of the worst schools in the state. One of the things they didn't talk about was how there was once industry in Northwest Huntsville, where I'm from, and all of the industry left. And they went to the other side of town. And at Huntsville, before it was integrated, when it was a segregated school, it was created when the area was wider, there was more resources. That the money and the resources, even the Black middle class, left that part of Huntsville, and we tumbled down the economic ladder. And so, if you have a red line, economically disadvantaged area by law and custom, then you are obviously going to have a place where poverty is going to cluster, where poverty clusters, all of the things that accrue with poverty cluster. And one of the things that was always interesting is that Black success, and this is the reason why I challenge exceptionalism in the book. Black success was always about individuals, and Black
Yeah.
failure was always about Black people. So if a Black person got into a fight, it was a big fight. It was like Johnson High School is out of control. If a Black person got a merit scholarship, this inner city kid overcomes, blah, 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 and gets the scholarship. And I used to say, well, why is it that it's only our trauma that is judged as a collective and never our successes?
It's such a good point. It gave me a lot to think about that part of the book. That I think because I also think we give ourselves a pass sometimes as white people that like if you're good enough, you'll make it out. And look,
Yeah.
this kid's getting a free ride to Sewanee. See, like,
Yeah.
what's the
So
people?
yeah, and this is the funny part, and I want to make sure that so when I say this, sometimes people misunderstand the point that I'm trying to make. I want to say it well. When I got to college, I thought that everyone who had gotten to college went through what I went through to get to college. In other
Mm,
words, it was a big deal in my family. We're the first ones in my generation. My sister was the first one. I give my sister the credit, but she'll yell at me. My sister is 2 years older, who's a pediatric cardiac intensivist. Can't even say it, but she does upper preoperative care for pediatric for children. So, anyways, she's the first one. I'm second. I thought that everyone who went to college had that sense of I'm going to change my family's and my neighborhood trajectory by my interest in the college. I had no idea that you could be a C student, and if your parents had enough money, you could just pay to go to college. And so I went to college. All of these people who were just getting drunk. I'm not being like judgmental in a puritanical way. I'm like, wait a minute, you're getting drunk and you're getting high. You're just messing around because you know that when you graduate, your family has a job and a business waiting for you, and you have the privilege to take high school flippantly and your first few years of college flippantly because you know you had a future set for you. And I said that changed my definition of justice, because justice now is the opportunity for ordinary Black people to flourish.
hmm
Because I knew a bunch of ordinary white students in my school, and every single Black person almost who went there had some tremendous story. And I said, well, hold on. Where are my C student high school Black kids? Oh, I know why they're not legacy admissions, because when the legacies were started, Jim Crow and segregation existed, and Black people literally couldn't come. And the long-term economic impact of those advantages that began generations back are what allowed for people to say, I can dole out $50,000 a semester for someone to go to college. They got me to go to Swanee, and Swanee is a great school. They got me to go when someone walked up to me and said, the recruiter said, when you graduate, your brain will be worth $200,000. He said, I remember it. I was like, well, my mom makes $25,000 a year. That's 8 years of my family's income for an education. I couldn't imagine it.
Yeah.
And the idea that people pay tuition. And I was just like, wow. And sorry, this is, I'll say a thing about the way this relates directly to the book. One of the stories that I tell is of my mom's father and how he grew up. He was born in 1937, I think. So he's growing up. He starts picking cotton when he's 4 years old in the 1940s. He's a 4-year-old kid who would pick cotton, and then he would go to school, and they would let them out of school for harvest time, um, so that he could, pick more cotton. And because it was a tenant farm, at the end of every year, him and his family would go, and they would go to the white person who owned the land, and the guy would say he just barely broke even. But it's Jim Crow, and even though they couldn't negotiate it,
Right.
and so by the time my grandfather gets to his freshman year in high school, he does straight A's when he's actually in school, but he's like 16, 17 years old because he's missed so much time from picking cotton to enrich another family. So he has to drop out of school. And had he wanted to go to college anyway, he couldn't go to college because most of them were segregated. And we all know that the biggest predictor of college education is the education of your parents.
hmm
So my grandfather was raised in the context of segregation, primary board education, and massive resistance. Well, that has a direct impact on my mother, who's raised in that context. And so
hmm
I'm really the first generation in my family to be raised by someone who went to integrated school. She started her schools are integrated in like the first grade. And so what I'm saying is the economic reality of Jim Crow isn't some abstraction. It's that it's that my grandparents' labor enriched another family that I'm sure that wealth was passed down from person to person. So we talk about the long tail of racism in the South. It's not a hypothetical. For me, it's a lived experience.
We're talking to Esau McCaulley. His new memoir is How Far to the Promised Land? And we'll be right back. I wanted to talk, Esau, a little bit about your path to becoming a preacher. Was it the
Yeah.
same grandfather that was a preacher or a
Same
different
grandfather.
Okay, so he was a preacher, and it
Yeah.
was your grandmother that really had you marked from it from the beginning. Do I have that right?
It's funny. It's the grandmother on the other side
Oh,
of the
okay.
family. So yeah, it kind of switched back and forth. My father's grandmother was the one who had me marked from a childhood, but my grandfather on my mom's side, Theodore Bone was the preacher in the family, one of
And
many.
was this something as a child that made sense to you? Was it something that you at first resisted and found your way to? How did it come into your life?
Well, in my neighborhood, we tended, at least in my family, we tend towards binaries. So there's a joke that we're either kind of in the streets or in the church. And so I never thought that I was going to be a minister when I was growing up. Who wants to be a minister when they're a kid? I want to be a football coach. Um, but there's this moment that I talk about in the book, and I don't want to give away too much of it, but I found myself in this neighborhood that I shouldn't have been in. And these people come up to me and they kind of say, what are you doing here? Kind of where you from, what you doing in our space. And normally it wouldn't have been a big deal, but I noticed that one of the people who was questioning me had a gun. And that kind of took the entire conversation to another level, an existential level. And I don't know why. To this day, I don't know why. The question of who are you in that moment took on an existential question. Like it was almost like the voice of God through this 15-year-old, 16-year-old boy. And I was like, well, who am I? Am I just like the combination of all of these hostilities that I've developed over the last, 15 or 20 years on this planet? Am I just someone trying to be different from my father? Am I just another statistic waiting to happen? And much to my surprise, the words that came out of my mouth is that I'm a Christian, which is a weird thing to say. And if I could, I was like, I remember I said, if I could have chased those words down and pulled them back in my mouth, I would have. Because we had this idea in my neighborhood that if you're scared, go to church. The religion was for people who were afraid. And I wasn't afraid of those boys. I was just tired. And that that moment led me to realize I felt a sense of this entire game that we play in my neighborhood. It's a game where there are no winners. And that I know that for a lot of people, religion and Christianity is just another hustle. It's just another way to get by. But I did think there was a different and better and more profound way of encountering God, where we saw this idea that the needy and the stepped on people of the world are valuable and deserve care and protection, and that we can all become better people. And that I wanted to talk about that, but not in the way that I was raised to do. I'm not like, if anyone has a picture of kind of like this, the down home Southern preacher of, oh, there's nothing wrong with that. That just wasn't who I was. I was much more introspective. And I felt like there's this song by this guy named Chance the Rapper. And he has this line where he says, I talk to God in public, in his music. And I
Mm.
felt like in my brain, I just need to talk to God in public, to ask him the questions that were being asked of my community out loud. Like, why do you allow these things to happen? Why are we experiencing these kinds of things? And what good might you have to offer us so we might point to a better life? And so I don't think I experienced a call to become a Baptist pastor like my grandfather, much to his eternal disappointment. But I do feel like I was called to become a writer who explored these things with the pen instead of the pulpit.
That your ministry has actually become these books.
And I didn't know it at the time because there was no
Uh-huh.
category. There's no category. I promise you, I didn't know one person in my neighborhood who said, I'm going to be a writer. And I
Right.
didn't know any writers. One of the questions I get asked all of the time is like, how did you know you wanted to write for the New York Times? Or how did you conceive of that dream? It's like, I didn't even conceive of it. I didn't even apply for it. They sent me, people reached out to me and it kind of developed organically, but I couldn't even in my imagination dream of one day having the opportunity to write for the Times or the Atlantic or the Washington Post. It was something, one of the things that people misunderstand about kind of this idea that you either choose drugs or you choose sports or you choose the church. That it's because we're simplistic. But sometimes you can only dream for what you can see. My children, they just assume they're even like my son is my youngest is 7 years old. She just assumes she's going to college. She
Yeah.
talks about going to college where dad goes to college. And their mom is a doctor and their father is a professor and a writer. So their imagination is so big that they think they can be anything. And it's easier to say that any kid can think they can be anything, but it's hard to dream for what you haven't seen. And so for me, I didn't know that it was writing, that I was feeling this sense of calling to, but I knew that the standard ways of being that were common in my neighborhood didn't fit what I felt called to do.
Now that you are a parent, you talk in the book. I'm going to give you another quote from your book. You said, "My children glimpse only part of my upbringing, the best part of it.
Yeah,
But I want to tell them about the hard times too, because there is no joy without suffering, and it is both the joy and the suffering that make me who I am." So how do you
yeah,
talk to your kids about your whole story?
yeah. One of the things that happened, well, my kids go home for Thanksgiving and Christmas and these holidays. So that's where no matter what's going on in your family and in your neighborhood, everyone comes together, you eat good food, and everyone's happy. And to their perception of my family is kind of distorted. They can kind of tell because the neighborhood isn't as nice, but it's a fine neighborhood. It's not like my mom's living in like a nice lower middle class neighborhood. But they kind of know but they see it seems pretty ordinary to them.
Hmm.
What they didn't see were the things that surround it, like what was life like before Thanksgiving and after Thanksgiving. And so the hard part is when you grow up in poverty, you feel a sense of responsibility for that community. When you don't grow up in that place, you don't have the sense of responsibility because it's alien to you. And how do you tell that story in such a way that it's not just, you don't know what it was like when I was a kid, but to capture the complexity. And in part, this may seem super selfish. Part of how far to the promised land is a gift to them, so that they don't see their dad or even black poverty as this stereotypical. They're all suffering. They're all miserable, or it's all joy. And so, actually, the book itself is the attempt to explain to them what their dad and other poor black Southerners went through, and our responsibility to make the world a little bit more of a just place. I don't want my children to experience the same poverty and difficulty that I did, but I want them to get in the feeling. And I feel like as a writer, it is there's people in this book who wouldn't let me go. Their stories who wouldn't let me go.
Yeah.
They changed and they shaped how I viewed the world. And I thought that maybe by giving these stories to my children and to the reader, it would change them and shape how they view the world as well.
Absolutely. The idea that hard lives are beautiful in their own way. That's where the book
Yeah.
sort of ends, right? And
Yeah.
it's not just the people who made it all the way to the promised land
Yes.
who deserve to be remembered and
Yeah.
lauded for what they did.
Yes. That's the exact. I think that what happens when you have an exemplar is that we know how the story ends and we know what to do. We boo the racism, we boo the poverty, we boo the injustice, and we cheer the person through the book. And we get to the end, we go, that wasn't a great emotional experience. I booed at the right parts, I clapped at the right
Right.
parts. I'm done.
I know who
I'm
to root
now
for. Right.
and I'm done. But I wanted to say, well, what about these stories that end in different places? What do you do with them? I told the story of my cousin who who passes away due to AIDS during the beginning of the AIDS pandemic, kind of similar to when COVID. We didn't understand it. We didn't know how it was
Yes.
spread. And her life is complicated, but there was some beauty in that life. And like her life matters too. And especially the way she's treated vis-a-vis the healthcare industry. And I want to say, we need to wrestle with this story as well. And not simply as a tragedy, but as a human life lived with dignity that has its own hardware beauty. I guess what I want to really say is I didn't want to say that my entire childhood and neighborhood and community was a wash. We can just toss it to the side because that's not how I viewed those people. And I know what it's like for people to ignore us, to stereotype us, to everyone when I was growing up had the microphone and the newspaper, and they got to tell the story of my community. And if I have one passion in life, is that I said, no, 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 you don't get to tell our story anymore. That we get to tell our story. And our story, yes, it has pain. Yes, it has some of our own brokenness and trauma, but there's also a beauty there. And you are going to have to see us. And you're going to have to pay attention to us. You're going to have to reckon with us as the people who deserve dignity and respect.
Esau McCaulley's new memoir is called How Far to the Promised Land. I'm sure you can tell from having listened to this episode just how beautiful it is. And I loved this book. I'm going to put the link in the show notes so everybody can buy it. And Esau, tell us where else we can find you on the internet.
Well, I have an odd name, Esau McCaulley, and the only other person my father passed away. He's the only other person who has that name. So you can look at me at Esau McCaulley on Twitter, Instagram. What is it called now? X? Oh my goodness. Threads, Instagram,
Whatever it's called
X
today.
that thing finally dies. It's a slow death. But all of the social media
All the
places,
places.
you can find me. And I have a website, esauMcCaulley.com as well.
Thank you so much for talking to me today.
You're welcome. You have a great day.